All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Hi, I'm Amelia, a 34-year-old secretary from California. Sharing this is hard, but I need to process how my husband Daniel's affair with a coworker from another department shattered our 9-year marriage. It began when I started noticing the little things. The way he'd suddenly protect his phone screen, the new perfume scent on his jacket that wasn't mine, the late nights at the office that never used to happen. There was a distance growing between us, a cold space in our bed that had nothing to do with the winter air. I told myself I was being paranoid, that stress was getting to me. But that tiny seed of doubt, it grows roots. It wraps around your heart and your lungs until you can't breathe without thinking about it. Until you have to know the truth, no matter how much it will destroy you. The company retreat was supposed to be a fun thing, a weekend at a lodge in Big Sur to boost morale and foster interdepartmental collaboration. Daniel had been oddly resistant to going, which was my first clue, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. He'd complained about the drive, the forced socializing, the pointlessness of it all. I'd chalked it up to his general dislike for corporate nonsense, and had actually spent an evening convincing him it would be good for him, for his visibility within the company. The irony of that now is a physical pain, a sharp, cold knot right beneath my ribs. The discovery happened not in a dramatic, cinematic way. There was no phone left unlocked on a table, no passionate embrace witnessed in a shadowy corridor. It was something stupid. Something so small and insignificant it shouldn't have mattered. We were at a mixer on the first night, a sea of colleagues in casual Friday wear holding plastic cups of cheap wine. Daniel was across the room, talking animatedly with a group from marketing. I decided to play the good wife and bring him a fresh drink. I weaved through the crowd, coming up beside him just as he was finishing a story. He didn't see me. He was laughing, his hand resting lightly on the arm of a woman I vaguely recognized, Sarah from the design team. I'd seen her at a few all-hands meetings. Pretty, in a sharp, artistic way. He finished his story and she laughed, tilting her head back. God, Daniel, you're hilarious. And then she did it. She reached out and casually, effortlessly, picked a piece of lint off the shoulder of his sweater. It was an intimate gesture, the kind of thing a wife does. The kind of thing I do. Her fingers brushed the fabric of his collar, and he didn't flinch. He didn't move away. He just smiled down at her, a soft, private smile that didn't belong here, in this loud room full of strangers. It was the smile he used to reserve for me over a candlelit dinner, a smile that said, I see you, and you're my person. My hand, holding the plastic cup, went numb. The noise of the party faded into a dull, roaring static. In that frozen moment, 1,000 tiny inconsistencies snapped into a horrifying, perfect focus. The new brand of coffee he suddenly liked, the specific way he'd been humming a song I'd never heard before, the fact that he'd started using a different phrase for goodbye on his calls. It was all her. It had always been her. The world didn't stop. No one gasped. The music kept playing. But my 9-year marriage ended right there, with a piece of lint and a stranger's hand on my husband's shoulder. The drive back from Big Sur was a silent, 100-mile vacuum. Daniel knew. The moment I'd handed him that untouched drink and walked away without a word, he knew that I knew. He didn't try to explain in the car. What could he possibly say? The evidence wasn't digital or concrete. It was written in the air between them, in that casual, devastating familiarity. He just stared out his window, and I stared out mine, the hum of the engine, the only sound in our rolling tomb. We didn't speak for 2 days. The house became a museum of our former life, every object a carefully preserved exhibit of a dead era. I'd walk past the sofa where we'd cuddle during movie nights, and I'd feel nothing but a hollow, aching cold. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I'd just wander from room to room, my mind replaying that moment on a relentless, torturous loop. Her hand, his smile, the lint. On the 3rd day, the numbness cracked open, and something else poured out. It wasn't rage. It was a frantic, bizarre energy that made my skin feel too tight. I couldn't just wander anymore. I had to do something. I found myself in the garage at 2 a.m., staring at the recycling bin, then at the grill. It was a stupid, impulsive thought, but it felt like the only logical thing in the world. I wasn't going to burn his things. That was too aggressive, too final. I was going to burn my things. the things that tied me to him. I marched back inside and went to my jewelry box, the one he'd bought me for our 5th anniversary. I didn't go for the expensive pieces. I went for the silly, sentimental ones. The ticket stub from our first concert, laminated into a keychain. The handwritten note he'd left on my coffee machine one morning years ago, telling me he loved me. A dried flower from a bouquet he'd given me just because. A collection of tiny paper fortunes from all the Chinese takeout dinners we'd shared. I gathered this pathetic archive of us in a metal mixing bowl and carried it out to the backyard. The night air was cold, and the backyard was pitch black, illuminated only by the dim glow of the patio light. I felt like a sleepwalker, moving with a purpose I didn't fully understand. I crumpled old newspapers under the grill grate, placed the bowl on top, and doused it all in lighter fluid. The match hissed to life in my hand, a tiny, defiant star in the overwhelming darkness. I dropped it. The fire whooshed up, orange and blue and hungry, consuming the paper, curling the edges of the ticket stub, turning the love note to black ash. I watched it all burn, the flames reflecting in my wide, unblinking eyes. I thought it would feel cathartic. I thought it would feel like release. But as I stood there, shivering in my nightgown, the acrid smell of smoke and regret filling my lungs, I just felt ridiculous. This wasn't strength. This was the performance of a heartbroken woman who had no idea how to process a pain this big. I wasn't burning the past. I was just creating a weird, sad little bonfire for one in the middle of the night, a perfect monument to my own devastation. The fire died down, leaving behind a pile of ash and one semi-melted keychain. I left it all there on the grill, went back inside, and finally cried, not for him, but for the woman I was before that retreat, the one who believed in laminated ticket stubs and the sacredness of a simple, intimate gesture. The phase of bizarre, nocturnal grief rituals had to end. Waking up with the smell of smoke in my hair and a hollow pit in my stomach was no way to live. The ashes of my sentimental bonfire were still sitting in the grill, a grim reminder of my midnight meltdown, and every time I looked out the kitchen window, a hot wave of shame would wash over me. I wasn't processing my pain, I was just performing it for an audience of one, and it was a terribly depressing show. Daniel was living in the guest room, a ghost haunting the periphery of my life, and our interactions were reduced to terse practical notes left on the fridge. The silence in the house was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. I knew I had to find a way to fill it, to do something that was just for me, something that existed entirely outside the wreckage of my marriage. The answer came from a place I least expected, a buried memory from a childhood art class. I had always loved the feel of clay. In high school, ceramics was my escape. The 1 hour a day where my mind would go quiet, focused entirely on the centrifugal force of the wheel and the cool, slick mud beneath my fingers. I hadn't touched clay in over 15 years. On a whim, fueled by a desperate need to do anything other than stare at the same 4 walls, I searched for local pottery studios. I found one a 20-minute drive away, a place called The Mud Room that offered open studio time for adults. Signing up felt like a rebellion. It was the first decision I'd made in weeks that wasn't a direct reaction to Daniel's betrayal. Walking into the studio for the first time was like crossing a threshold into another world. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and mineral spirits. The space was bustling but quiet, save for the low hum of wheels and the soft, rhythmic scraping of tools. No one looked up as I entered. Everyone was lost in their own world of creation. I felt a pang of intimidation, looking at the experienced potters pulling elegant, tall vases from lumps of clay. My hands felt clumsy and unfamiliar. The instructor, a kind woman with clay smudged on her apron, set me up with a wedged lump of brown earthenware and guided my hands through the basic centering process. It was a battle. The clay fought me, wobbling uncontrollably, my wrists aching with the unfamiliar strain. My first attempt collapsed into a sad, soggy pancake. The second shot off the wheel entirely. Frustration bubbled up, hot and familiar, the same feeling I'd had staring at that grill. But here, in this space, failure wasn't final. It was just part of the process. You simply balled up the clay and started again. And then, on the 3rd try, something clicked. I stopped forcing it. I stopped thinking about Daniel, about Sarah, about the lint, about the ashes. I just listened to the wheels hum and focused on the pressure of my palms, the steadying presence of my fingers. The clay began to yield, to center, to become a perfect, symmetrical cone rising under my touch. It was the most profound silence my mind had experienced in months. I wasn't a betrayed wife in that moment. I was just a pair of hands, creating order from chaos. I opened the centered clay, pulling up the walls, and instead of trying to make a perfect vase, I let my hands do what they wanted. What emerged was strange, lumpy, and utterly imperfect. A small, asymmetrical bowl with a crooked rim. It was nothing like the beautiful pieces around me, but it was mine. I had made it. I had taken something formless and given it a shape. As I carefully wire-cut it from the wheel and placed it on a board to dry, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost entirely, a sense of capability. The problems were all still there, waiting for me outside the studio door. But for 1 hour I had forgotten them, and in that forgetting, I found a tiny, fragile seed of strength. I signed up for a weekly class on the spot. This wasn't about healing yet, it was about survival. And for now, that was enough. Weeks bled into a month, and the pottery studio became my sanctuary. My world had shrunk to a simple, manageable routine. Work, the studio, home. The silence in the house was now a familiar companion rather than a tormentor. I was learning to be alone without being lonely. My hands, once clumsy, were now developing a memory of their own, pulling taller, more symmetrical forms from the spinning clay. I'd even mustered the courage to glaze my first piece, that lopsided little bowl in a deep cobalt blue. It was far from perfect, but it was whole. It had survived the fire, both literally and metaphorically. One Saturday, flush with a newfound sense of independence, I decided to do something completely for myself. I drove out to a little farm on the outskirts of town that I'd passed 100 times but never visited. They had a small farmer's market and, according to their sign, a petting zoo. It sounded like a harmless, wholesome distraction. I was browsing through baskets of fresh strawberries, enjoying the warm sun on my face, when I heard it. A frantic, high-pitched bleating, followed by a startled yelp. I turned just in time to see a blur of white fur and legs barrel through a cluster of people near the goat pen. It was a pygmy goat, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, and it was on a mission. It dodged around a stroller, skidded past a display of jams, and made a beeline straight for me. I froze, my basket of strawberries forgotten. The goat didn't slow down. It just ducked its head and rammed playfully into my knees. Not hard enough to hurt, but with enough force to send me stumbling backward. My foot caught on an uneven patch of grass, and I landed with a soft thud on the ground, my strawberries scattering around me like little red marbles. The goat, seemingly pleased with its work, immediately started nibbling on the hem of my denim jacket. I was too stunned to be embarrassed. I just sat there, staring at this tiny, mischievous creature, when a shadow fell over me. "I am so sorry," a man's voice said, breathless and laced with panic. He's usually so well behaved. He must have slipped his lead. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sun. The man was tall, with kind eyes that were wide with apology. He was holding a broken piece of rope in one hand. He dropped to one knee, gently shooing the goat away from my jacket. "Bartholomew, you menace. Look what you've done." He offered me his hand. "Are you okay? Did you hurt yourself?" His concern was so genuine, so devoid of any pickup line pretension, that I couldn't help but laugh. It was a real laugh, one that bubbled up from my chest unexpectedly. I hadn't laughed like that in months. "I'm fine," I said, letting him help me up. His grip was firm and steady. "Just surprised. I've never been assaulted by a goat before." I brushed the grass from my jeans. Bartholomew was now happily munching on my spilled strawberries. "He has a particular fondness for berries and denim, apparently," the man said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Let me at least replace your strawberries. And the dry cleaning for the jacket. And, well, maybe a coffee as an apology for the attempted goat tackle." He looked so hopeful and so utterly flustered that it was endearing. This wasn't a meeting in a bar. It wasn't a calculated swipe on an app. It was absurd. It was random. It was the complete opposite of the corporate retreat where my life had unraveled. There was no subtext, no hidden agenda, just a cute guy and his disastrously escape-prone pygmy goat. I looked from his apologetic face to the goat, now covered in strawberry juice, and back again. My old self, the one from a year ago, would have politely declined, made an excuse, and hurried back to the safety of her predictable life. But that woman was gone. A coffee would be nice, I heard myself say, but I think Bartholomew deserves a treat too. He did all the hard work of breaking the ice, after all. The man's face broke into a relieved, brilliant smile. And for the first time since everything fell apart, the future didn't feel like a dark, empty room. It felt interesting. Our coffee date, or rather our goat-induced apology coffee, wasn't like any date I'd ever been on. There was no pretense, no carefully curated version of ourselves presented for approval. How could there be? We had both been covered in goat slobber and strawberry juice. His name was Tom, and he was a veterinarian who volunteered at the animal shelter attached to the farm on weekends. Bartholomew was a permanent resident, a surrender case Tom had grown too attached to rehome. Over lattes, he told me stories about his patients, the Labradors who ate socks, the cats with chronic anxiety, the parrot that learned to mimic a car alarm. He spoke about them not just with professional expertise, but with a genuine, deep-seated affection that made his eyes light up. I found myself talking too about things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. I told him about the mind-numbing quiet of my office job, and then, hesitantly, about the pottery. His interest wasn't polite. It was avid. "You make things? With your hands?" "That's incredible," he said, and he meant it. There was no judgment, only a quiet, respectful curiosity that felt like a balm on my raw nerves. We said a warm, easy goodbye, and he didn't ask for my number. He just said, "I hope I see you next Saturday. Bartholomew will be on a much shorter leash, I promise." And I found myself hoping for the same thing. The following weekend, I went back to the farm market, my heart doing a nervous little flutter I hadn't felt in over a decade. And he was there, this time with Bartholomew securely tethered to a post. Tom's face broke into a smile when he saw me, a simple, unguarded expression of pleasure that sent a warm rush through my veins. This became our rhythm. Every Saturday, I'd browse the market and then find him at the shelter, helping with the animals. I'd hold nervous kittens while he administered vaccines, or fill water bowls for the dogs, all while we talked about everything and nothing. It was in these small, unremarkable moments that I began to see the man he truly was. The green flags weren't grand gestures, they were woven into the fabric of his character. The most profound one happened on a rainy Saturday. The market was slow, and the shelter was quiet. We were in the back, where a litter of scraggly orphaned kittens was being kept warm under a heat lamp. One of them, the runt, was listless and refusing the bottle. Tom was patient, gently trying to coax it to eat, his large hands impossibly tender. A sappy, orchestral cover of a pop song came on the shelter's old radio. I barely noticed it, but I saw Tom's hands still for a second. I glanced at him and was stunned to see his eyes glistening. He looked away, embarrassed, wiping a quick hand across his face. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick. "This song. It was playing in the car the day we had to put my childhood dog, Scout, to sleep. It gets me every time." He wasn't afraid of the emotion. He didn't try to hide it or brush it off with a joke. He owned it. This big, strong man who spent his days healing creatures, unashamed of the tears that a memory brought him. In my previous life, vulnerability had been seen as a weakness. Daniel would have sooner chewed glass than admit a song made him cry. But here was Tom, offering me this fragile piece of his heart without a second thought. It was the most masculine thing I had ever seen. It wasn't about being stoic. It was about being real. He felt things deeply, and he wasn't afraid to show it. That moment did something to me. It dismantled a wall I didn't even know I had built so high. It wasn't about him being perfect. He had a chaotic, goat-owning, sometimes overly sentimental life. But his quirks were genuine. They were the foundation of who he was, a man who cared, deeply and without reservation, for the creatures that couldn't care for themselves. And in that quiet, rainy shelter, surrounded by the soft mewling of kittens, I felt a piece of my own fractured heart click back into place. I didn't say anything. I just reached out and placed my hand over his, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, a quiet thank you for his honesty. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through mine, and we sat there for a long time, listening to the rain and the radio, two imperfect people finding a perfect, quiet understanding in a world that had taught them both to expect much less. Our happiness didn't arrive with a grand fanfare. It didn't need to. It seeped into my life quietly, like the first light of dawn, filling all the cracks that betrayal had left behind. Our traditional happiness was built on a foundation that was uniquely, bizarrely ours. Our perfect weekend wasn't fancy dinners or dramatic gestures. It was a Saturday morning ritual of chasing Bartholomew around the yard before heading to the farmer's market, then spending the afternoon at the pottery studio. Tom would read a book or play with a shelter puppy he was fostering while I threw clay. He was my quiet, steady audience, the only person whose presence didn't feel like an intrusion on my solitude, but rather a complement to it. We were two independent orbits that had found a harmonious rhythm, gravitating around each other without collapsing into one another. One rainy Sunday, we found ourselves in my living room, surrounded by a ridiculous fortress of blankets and pillows we'd hauled off the bed and the sofa. We were attempting to build the world's most elaborate blanket fort, a childhood dream I'd never realized. Tom, with his veterinarian's logical mind, was trying to engineer a stable structural support using broom handles and textbooks. I was in charge of aesthetics, draping fairy lights and hanging my imperfect glazed pottery from the ceiling like bizarre, lumpy chandeliers. We bickered playfully about the correct placement of a cushion, argued over the optimal streaming service for a movie marathon, and laughed until our sides ached when Bartholomew, who had become a permanent, mischievous fixture in our lives, tried to help and nearly brought the entire construction down on our heads. We finally collapsed inside our soft, illuminated cave, a bowl of popcorn between us and a terrible 80s horror movie on the laptop. His arm was around me, my head was on his shoulder, and the sound of rain pattering against the window was the only soundtrack we needed. It was in that moment of perfect, silly contentment that the final twist of my entire story revealed itself. It wasn't about Daniel. It wasn't about being chosen over someone else or winning some invisible competition. The climax was this quiet, internal realization that bloomed in my chest, warm and certain. My biggest fear had always been being alone, abandoned, unwanted, left behind. I had built a life with Daniel on the foundation of that fear, mistaking dependence for love. But now, as I sat in a lopsided blanket fort with a man who cried during sappy commercials and whose best friend was a pygmy goat, I understood the upgrade. It wasn't about trading one man for a better one. It was about the woman I had become in the aftermath. I was no longer the secretary who defined herself by her marriage. I was a potter. I was a survivor. I was someone who could build a life and a halfway decent blanket fort on her own. I didn't need Tom. I didn't need anyone to complete me. And that was the miraculous part. I chose him. I chose his kindness over cynicism, his authenticity over pretense, his quiet strength over performative masculinity. I chose him every single day, not out of fear of being alone, but because he made my weird, post-heartbreak, pottery-filled life a million times more fun and infinitely more real. He made my independent orbit brighter. I turned my head and kissed his shoulder, a simple gesture that held the weight of my entire revelation. He looked down at me, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen and the warm glow of the fairy lights. "What was that for?" he asked, his voice soft. I just smiled, snuggling closer. "For being you," I said. And for the first time, that was more than enough. The blanket fort became a symbol, a testament to the fact that happiness could be constructed from the most mundane of materials: old blankets, laughter, and a shared willingness to be a little ridiculous. It was easy to lose myself in that new, cozy world with Tom, to let the past recede into a dull, painless ache. But life has a way of ensuring you don't forget your lessons too easily. The reminder came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a simple, bureaucratic envelope in the mail. It was from my lawyer. The final divorce papers were ready for my signature. Daniel had already signed his name on the dotted line, a swift, impersonal end to 9 years. Holding that envelope felt like holding a lead weight. It was the official death certificate of my old life. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on my kitchen counter for 2 days, a stark white monument to failure that I had to walk around, a ghost that wouldn't leave. I thought I had processed it all. I thought I was over it. But the sight of that legal document made my hands cold. A part of me was still that woman on the floor of the corporate retreat, watching her world dissolve. Tom noticed the shift in me. He saw the envelope, of course, and he saw the way my eyes would skitter away from it. He didn't press. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just made tea and let the silence sit between us, a comfortable, supportive presence. On the third day, I finally picked it up. My hands were trembling. I slid the thick stack of papers out and forced myself to read the cold, clinical language that detailed the dissolution of a marriage. Petitioner and respondent. Assets and liabilities. It was so sterile, so devoid of the human emotion it represented. I found Daniel's signature first. I stared at the familiar, looping slant of his handwriting that I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards. And then I saw it. Staring up from the line above his name was my old address. The one on the paperwork was our shared address, the house we bought together. But his current mailing address was listed just beneath it. It was an apartment downtown. And the zip code? It was the same zip code as Sarah's apartment building. I'd known intellectually that they were together. But seeing the proof, in black and white on an official court document, was a punch to the gut. The air left my lungs in a sudden whoosh. He hadn't just left me, he had seamlessly slotted himself into a new life, a new home, with her. The finality of it was devastating. I must have made a sound, a small wounded gasp, because Tom was beside me in an instant. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just looked from my face to the papers in my hand, and his expression softened with understanding. He gently pried the documents from my frozen fingers and placed them on the counter. Then he took both of my hands in his. They were warm and solid. "Look at me, Amelia," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I dragged my eyes away from the damning zip code and met his gaze. "That," he said, nodding toward the envelope, "is about ending something. It's about the past. It has nothing to do with what you're building right now. Nothing." He squeezed my hands. "You are not that address. You are not that signature. You are the woman who builds blanket forts and throws beautiful, lopsided bowls. You are kind, and you are strong, and you are right here." He wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know, but hearing it from him, in that moment, gave the knowledge weight and truth. He was right. The paperwork was an ending. But my life was about a beginning. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the tightness in my chest finally easing. I picked up the pen, and without letting myself think about it anymore, I signed my name on the line. It didn't feel like a defeat. It felt like the period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I put the pen down and turned to Tom. "Okay," I whispered. "It's done." He pulled me into a hug and I buried my face in his shoulder, not crying from sadness, but from relief. The ghost was finally, officially, laid to rest. Life after signing the papers held a new, lighter quality. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been my background noise for months finally switched off. I wasn't just playing at being happy, I was genuinely learning the shape of it again. Tom and I settled into a comfortable, uncomplicated rhythm. Our time together felt earned, a reward for having navigated our own separate storms to find this quiet harbor. We didn't need grand plans. Our happiness was in the small, shared mundanities. Grocery shopping together, arguing over the best way to load the dishwasher, trying and failing to teach Bartholomew not to eat the petunias in my tiny patio garden. It was all so wonderfully, boringly normal, and I cherished every second of it. This newfound peace, however, was about to face its first external test. My mother was coming for a visit. She lived a few states away, and our relationship was a complex tapestry of love, expectation, and a generous helping of guilt. She had been devastated by the divorce, not just for my pain, but for the shattering of the perfect image she held of my life. The successful husband, the nice house, the stable future. I told her about Tom, of course, but I'd kept the details light, describing him as a nice guy I'd been seeing. I knew she'd have questions. I just hadn't prepared for the inquisition. She arrived on a Friday evening, her perfume filling my small house, her eyes immediately scanning every corner for signs of decline or disorder. She approved of the clean floors but frowned at the lone, quirky pottery piece on the bookshelf amongst my more traditional decor. "Interesting," was all she said, her tone implying the opposite. Dinner was a carefully orchestrated affair. I'd cooked her favorite meal, and Tom, bless him, had offered to come over and meet her. He arrived with a bouquet of flowers and a calm smile, utterly unaware of the subtle scrutiny he was about to undergo. The conversation over pasta was a minefield disguised as polite chatter. "So, Tom," my mother began, sipping her wine, "Amelia tells me you're a veterinarian. That's a very noble profession. Very stable. It sounded like a compliment but carried the weight of a comparison. Daniel had been in finance. It has its moments, Tom said easily, completely missing the subtext. Just this week, I had to explain to a very concerned Great Dane owner that his dog wasn't, in fact, dying, but just exceptionally dramatic about getting his nails trimmed. He told the story with warmth and humor, and I saw a flicker of genuine amusement in my mother's eyes before she schooled her features back into polite neutrality. The real test came when I brought out dessert. "And where did you two meet again?" she asked, her smile a little too sharp. I tensed, gripping my fork. The truth, a goat tackle at a farmer's market, was not going to play well with her sense of propriety. I was about to fabricate a story about a coffee shop when Tom jumped in. "Actually, it was at the farmer's market out on Route 10, he said, beaming. "My goat, Bartholomew, has a bit of a mischievous streak." He decided Amelia's denim jacket was the most delicious thing he'd ever seen and literally knocked her off her feet to get a taste. I had to come over and apologize profusely. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother stared at him, her dessert fork suspended in mid-air. I held my breath, waiting for the polite, cutting remark about irresponsible pet ownership or the sheer absurdity of it all. But then, something miraculous happened. A sound escaped her, a small, choked snort. Then another, and then she was laughing, a real, deep, unguarded laugh that I hadn't heard from her in years. "He was assaulted by a goat?" she wheezed, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "Oh, my dear, only you." Tom grinned, relieved, and launched into more stories about Bartholomew's antics, and my mother listened, actually listened, her laughter softening the sharp edges of her judgment. She was still my mother, and I knew there would be more questions about long-term prospects later, but in that moment, she saw it. She saw the authenticity I'd fallen for. She saw that stability wasn't always a job title. Sometimes, it was the man who showed up with flowers and ridiculous stories, who wasn't afraid to be exactly who he was. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was just being Tom. And for the first time, that was enough for her too. It was the final, external seal of approval I hadn't known I needed. The life I was building wasn't just real to me, it was becoming real to everyone else too. The approval of a parent, however reluctantly given, has a strange way of solidifying a reality. After my mother's visit, something shifted. Tom wasn't just my boyfriend, he was an acknowledged part of my life, someone who had passed a crucial test. We started talking about the future in more concrete terms, not with the frantic, dream-building energy of my youth, but with a calm, practical certainty. It was about making space for each other. His tiny apartment above the veterinary clinic was overflowing with animal supplies and medical textbooks, and my house, though spacious, still held the ghostly echoes of a life I was no longer living. We began the slow, deliberate process of merging our worlds, and it started with the most logical place, the spare room, which had been Daniel's office and then just a storage space for my grief. We decided it would become my proper pottery studio, a place with better light, more space for shelves, and a door I could close to keep a certain curious goat at bay. The project was our first real collaboration. Tom, with his practical hands, took charge of building sturdy tables and installing proper lighting. My job was the emotional archaeology, sorting through the boxes that had been hastily shoved in there months ago. Most of it was easy. Old files of Daniel's, obsolete computer parts, things that could be tossed or donated without a second thought. I was feeling empowered, efficient, until I opened a flat cardboard box tucked at the back of the closet. It was my wedding dress. Not preserved in some fancy box, just folded neatly, the lace yellowing slightly with time. I hadn't thought about it in years. I sat back on my heels, the pristine white fabric pooling in my lap. It felt like touching an artifact from a forgotten civilization. I could remember the day I bought it, the excitement, the absolute certainty that I was making the right choice. That woman felt like a stranger to me now, a naive girl playing dress-up in a fantasy of forever. I wasn't sad. I was curious. I stood and held it up against myself in the full-length mirror that stood in the corner, still waiting to be moved. I didn't see a blushing bride. I saw a woman in a jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, holding up a symbol of a broken promise. The contrast was jarring, but not in a bad way. It was like looking at a before and after picture where the after was unequivocally better. The woman in the mirror was stronger. She had calluses on her hands from clay and a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The dress was just a costume she'd outgrown. I was so lost in the reflection that I didn't hear the doorbell. Tom was in the backyard, cutting wood, so I dropped the dress back into its box and went to answer it, my mind still miles away. I pulled the door open without thinking, a casual smile on my face that instantly froze and shattered. Daniel stood on my porch. He looked different. Older, thinner, with a nervous energy that seemed to vibrate around him. He was holding a small box. "Amelia," he said, his voice too loud for the quiet afternoon. Hi, I could only stare. My heart wasn't pounding with longing or pain. It was hammering with pure, unadulterated shock. We hadn't spoken since the lawyers took over. He was a ghost, and now he was standing on my welcome mat, solid and real. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" My voice came out flat, colder than I intended. I was cleaning out some stuff at the new place," he said, shifting his weight. "I found this. It's yours." He thrust the box at me. I took it numbly. Inside were a few forgotten books, a scarf I'd loved, and a framed photo of us from a trip to the beach, our faces sunburnt and happy. It felt like he was returning evidence. "You could have mailed it," I said, my grip tightening on the cardboard. "I know, I wanted to see you." His eyes darted past me, into the house, taking in the changes, the moved furniture, the ladder, the sound of Tom's saw buzzing in the backyard. His gaze landed on the open door to the spare room, on the box with the wedding dress sitting plainly in the middle of the floor. His face paled. "What's all this? I'm making a pottery studio," I said, my voice regaining some of its steadiness. This was my home. He was the visitor here. He looked from the dress to me, a confused frown on his face. "You're getting rid of it?" And in that moment, I saw the entire vast canyon that had opened up between us. He saw the dress as something to be kept or discarded, a trophy of what was. I saw it as raw material for what could be. "No," I said, and a calm certainty settled over me. "I'm going to cut it up. Use the fabric for texturing clay. Maybe use the lace to imprint on a series of bowls." I shrugged. "It's good fabric. It shouldn't go to waste." He looked horrified. To him, it was sacrilege. To me, it was the most natural form of recycling, transforming the symbol of my old life into a tool for my new one. The buzzing saw in the backyard stopped. A moment later, Tom appeared in the doorway behind me, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a solid, quiet presence at my back. He looked at Daniel, then at me, his expression neutral but watchful, ready to step in if I needed him, but trusting me to handle it. Daniel saw him. He saw the easy way Tom stood in my space, the protective, unassuming way he supported me. He saw the future I was building, literally, right behind me. The confrontation he maybe hoped for, tears, yelling, regret, wouldn't happen here. He had become irrelevant. "Right," he mumbled, taking a step back. "Well, that's something." He turned and walked away without another word, got in his car, and drove off. I closed the door slowly, leaning against it. Tom came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" I looked at the box of my old things, then toward the room with my future. I took a deep breath. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it. "I really am." The past had come knocking, and I had answered the door not as a victim, but as the architect of my own life. And I liked the blueprint. The encounter with Daniel left a strange energy in its wake, a static charge that took a day to dissipate. It was a final, unexpected test, and the profound sense of peace I felt afterward was the proof I'd passed. The past had truly lost its power to hurt me. With that chapter definitively closed, I could throw myself completely into the present. My new studio took shape with a speed that surprised me. Within a week, the room was transformed. The walls were a clean, bright white. Tom's sturdy tables were positioned perfectly under the new LED lights, and my wheels stood ready, waiting. My first project, conceived the moment Daniel had left my porch, was already underway. I had cut the lace from my wedding dress and was carefully pressing it into the surface of a series of small, delicate pinch pots. It wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of reclamation. I was taking something beautiful but burdened, and turning it into something new, something that was entirely and only mine. My life had found its new, steady rhythm: work, the studio, Tom. It was a happy rhythm, one I could have comfortably settled into for the foreseeable future. Which is exactly why the universe, it seemed, decided to throw one more curveball. It wasn't a bad one, just unexpected. My boss called me into her office on a Tuesday morning. "Amelia," she said, gesturing for me to sit, "we've landed the Anderson account. It's huge for us. They're based in Seattle, and they want a company representative to fly out next week for a 2-day project kickoff meeting. I'd like to send you." I stared at her, my mind blank. Me? I was a secretary. I organized meetings. I didn't represent the company at them. "You're the most organized person in this office," she said, as if reading my mind. "You know the details of this project inside and out, because you've been scheduling every preliminary call for the last 6 months. You're the obvious choice. It's a quick trip. Fly out Monday, meetings Tuesday, fly back Wednesday. You'll be fine." The idea was terrifying. I hadn't traveled alone since before I was married. Daniel had always handled the itineraries, the rental cars, the navigating of unfamiliar cities. The thought of doing it all by myself sent a familiar, anxious tremor through my hands. My first instinct was to decline, to cite 100 reasons why I wasn't the right person. But then I stopped myself. I wasn't that woman anymore. The woman who needed someone to handle things for her. I was the woman who built studios and faced down ex-husbands. I took a deep breath. "Thank you for the opportunity," I heard myself say, my voice surprisingly steady. I'd be happy to go. The days leading up to the trip were a whirlwind of preparation. I made lists, confirmed flights, and researched the Seattle office location until I could have drawn a map from memory. Tom was my biggest cheerleader. "You're going to be amazing," he said the night before I left, helping me fold a blazer into my carry-on. "Just remember, you know more than you think you do. And if you get lost, just call me. I'll be your satellite navigation." He kissed me, and for a moment, the anxiety receded. The Seattle air was cool and damp when I landed, a stark contrast to the California sun. The hotel was sleek and impersonal, and the silence of my room was overwhelming. This was it, my first true test of complete independence. I unpacked my suitcase, hung up my blazer, and laid out my notes for the next day's meeting. Then the loneliness crept in. It was a different loneliness than the one I'd felt in my empty house after Daniel left. That was a hollow, grieving emptiness. This was just quiet. I missed the familiar weight of Tom beside me on the couch, the ridiculous sound of Bartholomew bleeding from the backyard. I missed my studio. My phone buzzed. It was Tom. "How's the Emerald City?" "Survived the flight? Ty?" I smiled, my chest tightening with a fond ache. "Landed. Hotel is nice. Room is very quiet. CS23 appeared instantly. "Hold on, Bartholomew wants to say hi." A second later, a video popped up. It was a little shaky, shot from Tom's perspective. It showed Bartholomew in my studio of all places. He was nudging one of my spinning wheels with his nose. Then he turned and looked directly into the camera, letting out a short, demanding bleat. The video ended. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the sterile room. The loneliness vanished, replaced by a warm, golden thread of connection that stretched all the way from Seattle to California. He wasn't just checking in, he was showing me my life was waiting for me. He was giving me the strength to be here, alone, by reminding me I wasn't really alone at all. "Tell him I said hi back," I typed, my fingers feeling light. "That he's not allowed on the wheel when I'm not there TNS. No promises, TNS, 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 TNS. Why? He's got a real artistic temperament. Get some sleep, you're going to crush it tomorrow. I know it. DSI. Put the phone down and looked around the quiet hotel room. It didn't feel intimidating anymore. It felt like a stage. Tomorrow, I would walk into a room of strangers and represent my company. I would be competent. I would be professional. I would be the woman who flew to Seattle by herself. I got into the large empty bed, and for the first time I stretched out my arms and legs, claiming all the space for myself. It felt powerful. The trip was no longer a test, it was an adventure. And I was finally the heroine of my own story, ready for whatever came next. The Seattle trip was a revelation. I'd walked into those conference rooms with my heart hammering against my ribs, a chorus of insecurities screaming in my head that I was just a secretary, an imposter who'd stumbled into the wrong room. But a funny thing happened when the first presentation began. I did know the details. I'd scheduled the calls, taken the notes, organized the timelines. The information was a map I'd helped draw, and I knew it by heart. I wasn't just a passive participant. I contributed. I answered questions, clarified points, and even offered a suggestion on the project workflow that made the lead consultant nod in approval. The anxiety didn't vanish, but it transformed into a sharp, focused energy. I was competent. I was capable. I was flying solo, and the plane wasn't crashing. I returned to California on a high, my carry-on rolling behind me with a new, confident click. I felt taller. The world seemed sharper, brighter. I couldn't wait to see Tom, to tell him every detail, to share this victory with the person who had believed in me before I fully believed in myself. He was waiting for me at the arrivals gate, and the sight of him, wearing his slightly too formal for him shirt, holding a ridiculous sign that read Amelia's Entourage with a poorly drawn goat on it, made my heart swell so suddenly I thought it might burst. I dropped my bag and practically ran into his arms, laughing into his shoulder. "You are ridiculous," I mumbled, not letting go. "Did you crush it?" he asked, his voice muffled by my hair. "I crushed it," I confirmed, and the words felt like a sacred vow to myself. We drove back to my place, and I talked a mile a minute, recounting everything from the view of the rain over the city to the exact expression on my boss's face when I'd handled a tough question from the client. Tom listened, his hand resting on my knee, interjecting with the perfect mix of pride and humor. The house felt different when we walked in. It wasn't just my house anymore, it was our haven. The evidence of our life together was everywhere. His well-worn veterinary journals on the coffee table, Bartholomew's favorite toy by the door, the two mismatched mugs sitting side by side in the dishwasher. It was messy and imperfect and utterly perfect. Later that evening, as we were cleaning up after a dinner we'd cooked together, a comfortable silence settled between us. We were a team, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an easy, practiced rhythm. He washed, I dried. It was in that quiet, mundane moment that he broached the next step, his voice casual but his shoulders slightly tense. "So, with you being a high-powered business traveler now," he teased lightly, handing me a wet plate, "and me basically living here between my place and the shelter, it seems a little silly, doesn't it? Paying rent on two places." I stopped drying the plate, my hands stilling. He wasn't looking at me, focusing very intently on scrubbing a pot. My mind didn't race with panic. It didn't conjure images of failed commitments or smothering dependence. Instead, it presented a simple, logical picture: more mornings waking up together, more shared dinners, more time in the studio while he read on the couch. More of this, the quiet rhythm, the partnership. "It is silly," I agreed, my voice soft. He finally looked at me, hope and nervousness warring in his eyes. I placed the dry plate carefully in the cupboard and turned to him, leaning my hip against the counter. "But I have a condition. Anything," he said immediately, wiping his hands on a towel. "Bartholomew's shed has to stay at your old place. My studio is a goat-free zone. That's non-negotiable." I tried to keep a straight face, but a smile tugged at my lips. The relief that washed over his face was comical. He closed the distance between us in 2 strides, wrapping his wet arms around me and pulling me close. "I think we can arrange that," he laughed, kissing me. "I'll build him a palace in the backyard here. A 5-star goat hotel." It wasn't a dramatic proposal. It was better. It was a practical, loving conversation about merging the remaining pieces of our separate lives into one shared space. It was about building a future, not on grand promises, but on the solid daily foundation we'd already laid: washed dishes and inside jokes and a shared love for a troublesome animal. He was choosing me. I was choosing him. And we were both choosing a life that had plenty of room for both of us, exactly as we were. The high of my business success was incredible, but this feeling, this deep, steady, homecoming joy, was the real victory. I had gone to Seattle to find my independence, and I had returned ready to share it. The decision to merge our lives officially was less a single event and more a natural, gradual tide that washed over us, smoothing the edges of our separate existences into a single, shared shoreline. Tom's move was a slow, steady migration. A toothbrush appeared next to mine. A drawer in my dresser was quietly emptied of my old sweaters and filled with his t-shirts and socks. His collection of veterinary textbooks created a new, leaning tower on my bookshelf, right next to my growing library on ceramic glazes and firing techniques. We didn't have a formal move-in day, it just happened, a seamless transition from yours and mine to ours. The house, once a monument to a failed marriage, now hummed with a new, vibrant energy. It was louder, messier, and infinitely more alive. With Tom's official presence came the final, most chaotic, and most delightful piece of the puzzle, Bartholomew's permanent relocation. True to his word, Tom spent a weekend in my backyard, building what could only be described as a Caprine palace. It was a sturdy, handsome shed with a fenced-in run, complete with a ramp for Bartholomew to climb on and a custom-made sign that Tom had burned with a pyrography pen, Bartholomew's goat tillage. I laughed until I cried when I saw it. The neighbors probably thought we were insane, but I didn't care. This was our normal. Bartholomew took to his new kingdom with the entitled air of a returning monarch. He would spend his days basking in the sun, chewing on everything we didn't want him to, and watching us with an expression of profound judgment through the kitchen window. Our routines expanded to include him. Mornings now began with the ritual of feeding him his breakfast of grains and vegetables, and evenings often found us sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching him perform his bizarre goat yoga stretches as the sun set. It was during one of these quiet evenings that the final piece of my healing unexpectedly fell into place. Tom was inside answering an emergency call from the shelter about a dog that had eaten a sock. I was alone on the porch, the air turning cool, watching Bartholomew methodically destroy a cardboard box he deemed unworthy. The peace of the moment was so complete it was almost a physical thing, a warm blanket around my shoulders. I found my gaze drifting from the goat to the studio, its windows dark. Inside, on a shelf, sat the first series of bowls I'd made with the lace from my wedding dress. They were finished, fired, and glazed a deep, iridescent blue. I had thought that repurposing the dress would be the ultimate act of closure. And it was, in a way, but as I sat there, listening to the contented munching of a goat and waiting for the man I loved to finish saving a sock-eating dog, I realized the closure wasn't in the destruction of the old symbol. It was in the creation of a new one. The bowls weren't just about the past, they were about the present. They were beautiful and functional. They held fruit on my kitchen counter. They were a part of my daily life, a testament to the fact that I could take something broken and not just fix it, but make it into something better than it was before. Tom came back out, sighing as he dropped into the chair next to mine. The sock has been successfully retrieved. The dog is embarrassed but will live to eat another day. He reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, just watching the stars begin to prick through the twilight. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to look at me, his face soft in the fading light. "For what?" I gestured vaguely around us. At the goat, the shed, the house, the studio, at him. For all of this. For making my life weird again. In the best possible way. He smiled, that slow, easy smile that still made my heart flip. "You did that yourself, Amelia. I just brought the goat." He squeezed my hand. "And I'm really glad I get to be a part of it." The past was no longer a place I revisited with pain or anger. It was simply a chapter that had ended, making room for this one. The upgrade was never about finding a better man. It was about building a better life. And as I sat there holding the hand of a man who built goat palaces and didn't shy away from his feelings, with the evidence of my own strength and creativity shining from the windows of my studio, I knew I had succeeded. The shattered pieces hadn't just been glued back together. They had been melted down in the kiln of everything I'd endured and reshaped into something entirely new. Something sturdier and something uniquely, beautifully mine. The piece of our new routine was a living thing, breathing in time with the rhythm of our days. Mornings were a symphony of chaos. Tom scrambling for his keys, me trying to find a clean mug for coffee, Bartholomew voicing his loud, impatient opinion on the pace of his breakfast service. Evenings were the quiet counter-melody shared dinners, the soft scratch of Tom's pen as he made notes in patient charts, the steady hum of my wheel in the studio. I had thought this was the pinnacle, this comfortable, contented happiness. I was wrong. Life, I was learning, wasn't a summit you reached and stayed atop. It was a series of foothills, each offering a new, beautiful view, just when you thought the climb was over. The catalyst was a small, cream-colored envelope that arrived in the mail, mixed in with the bills and catalogs. It was an invitation to a local art walk, a quarterly event where studios and galleries in the downtown area opened their doors to the public. A flyer fell out, highlighting a section for emerging local artists and inviting submissions for a pop-up showcase. My heart gave a little leap, followed immediately by a familiar cold wash of doubt. Emerging artists. That wasn't me. I was a secretary who did pottery as a hobby. A passionate, all-consuming hobby, but a hobby nonetheless. I left the invitation on the kitchen counter, a silent question. Tom saw it that evening. He picked it up, read it, and didn't say a word. He just looked at me, a slow smile spreading across his face, and gave a single, firm nod. His belief was so absolute, so unshakable, that it momentarily silenced the voice of insecurity in my head. "I don't have anything worth showing," I finally murmured, voicing the fear. "Are you kidding?" he said, putting the invitation down and coming to stand in the doorway of my studio. He gestured at the shelves, which were now filled with my work. Bowls, vases, cups, and sculptures. Each piece a chapter in my recovery. The early, lopsided pieces stood next to the newer, more confident forms. The series imprinted with my wedding lace held a place of honor. "It's all worth showing. It's your story." His words unlocked something in me. This wasn't about being a famous artist. It was about sharing that story. It was about standing in a room and saying, "This is what I made from the ashes." The decision was terrifying and exhilarating. I filled out the application that night, my hand trembling only slightly. A week later, the acceptance email arrived. I had a spot. Panic immediately set in. Oh, we set in. What would I show? How would I display it? What if no one liked it? What if no one even looked? The following weeks were a whirlwind of focused creation. The studio became my command center. I worked with an intensity I'd never known, my vision finally catching up to my skill. I created a new series, inspired by the feeling of breaking open. I called them kintsugi vases, though I didn't use gold. Instead, I crafted vessels that looked as if they had been shattered and then put back together, the seams emphasized with dark, rough clay and bold, contrasting glazes. They were strong, beautiful, and unapologetic about their brokenness. Tom built me simple, elegant display stands from reclaimed wood, his quiet support the steady foundation for my creative storm. The night of the art walk arrived. I stood in my designated corner of the bustling gallery, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My pieces were arranged on Tom's stands, spotlights highlighting their textured surfaces. I felt naked, exposed. These weren't just bowls. They were pieces of my soul sitting out in the open for strangers to judge. Tom stood by my side, a solid, calming presence, his hand finding the small of my back. Breathe," he whispered. "They're perfect." The crowd flowed past. Some people glanced and moved on. But then a woman stopped. She leaned in close to one of the kintsugi vases, her eyes tracing the deliberate, fractured lines. "These are incredible," she said, turning to me. "They're so powerful. What's your inspiration?" I opened my mouth, expecting the old fear to choke me. But it didn't. I looked at my work, then at Tom, then back at the woman. "They're about realizing that things don't have to be perfect to be whole," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Sometimes the breaks are what make them strong. And beautiful." She smiled, a genuine, understanding smile. I love that. She wasn't the only one. Throughout the evening, people stopped. They asked questions. They touched the surfaces gently. They didn't just see pottery, they saw the story. And I told it over and over, each time feeling a little stronger, a little more real. I wasn't Amelia, the secretary. I wasn't Amelia, the betrayed wife. I was Amelia, the artist. And for the first time, standing in that gallery with my work around me and my partner beside me, the two identities didn't feel separate. They felt like they had finally, seamlessly, become one. The high from the art walk didn't fade so much as it settled, transforming from a bright, buzzing energy into a deep, steady hum of confidence. The world hadn't fundamentally changed. I still had my secretary job, my morning commute, my overflowing email inbox, but my perception of it had. I walked through the familiar halls of the office with a new posture. I was no longer just the person who organized other people's success. I was someone who created her own. I had stood in a room and claimed the title of artist, and no one could take that away from me. That certainty bled into everything, coloring my interactions with a new, quiet authority. I found myself speaking up in meetings, not just to relay information, but to offer opinions. I stopped prefacing my suggestions with, "This might be a stupid idea, but..." The change was subtle, but it was noticed. My boss, Linda, called me into her office again a few weeks later. This time, there was no big client trip to discuss. She gestured to the chair opposite her desk, her expression unreadable. "Amelia," she began, steepling her fingers, "I've been observing you since you got back from Seattle. Something's different." A flicker of the old anxiety sparked in my chest. Was I in trouble? Had I overstepped? "Oh," I managed, keeping my voice neutral. "The Anderson clients specifically mentioned how impressed they were with your preparedness and your insights during the kickoff," she continued. "And the work you've been doing since, you're taking more initiative. You're anticipating problems instead of just reacting to them. You're not just executing tasks, you're thinking strategically." I remained silent, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't. "The administrative workload for the Anderson account is massive," she said, leaning forward. "And it's only going to grow. We need a dedicated point person to manage it all, liaise between our team and theirs, handle the complex scheduling, manage the deliverables timeline." It's a step up. More responsibility, more visibility. And frankly, it requires a mind that can see the whole board, not just one piece. She paused, looking at me directly. "I'd like to offer you the role. The title would be Project Coordinator." I felt the air leave my lungs in a soft rush. Project Coordinator. It wasn't just a new title, it was a new identity within these walls. It was recognition. It was a direct result of the person I had become outside of them. The woman who built her own studio, who faced down her past, who showed her art to the world, had somehow made her way into this corporate office and demanded to be seen. I started, my mind racing. It meant more hours, more pressure. It would eat into my studio time. The old me would have hesitated, would have worried about not being good enough, about failing under the weight of expectation. But the new me saw it for what it was, another hill to climb, another view to earn. This wasn't a detour from my art, it was fuel for it. The financial security would allow me to invest in better equipment, more materials. The mental challenge would keep me sharp. I could be both, the secretary and the artist, the project coordinator and the potter, the woman who managed timelines and the woman who created beauty from clay. The pieces of my life weren't competing, they were converging. "I would love that," I said, my voice firm and clear. "Thank you for the opportunity, Linda. I won't let you down." She smiled, a genuine, approving smile. "I know you won't." I walked out of her office feeling like the ground beneath my feet had solidified. I went through the rest of the day in a daze of quiet triumph. When I got home, Tom was in the kitchen, attempting to make his famously elaborate and notoriously messy lasagna. Flour dusted the counter like a light snow, and Bartholomew was parked hopefully by his feet, waiting for a dropped noodle. "How was your day?" he asked, grinning as he layered pasta sheets. I dropped my bag on a chair and leaned against the counter, watching him. The domestic chaos was a perfect contrast to the corporate offer I'd just received. "It was good," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Really good. I got a promotion." The wooden spoon clattered against the pot. Tom turned, his face breaking into an expression of utter, unfiltered joy. He wiped his hands on a towel and swept me into a huge, flowery hug, lifting me off my feet. "That's amazing. I knew it. I knew they'd see it." He set me down, his hands on my shoulders, his eyes searching mine. "Are you happy? This is what you want?" I looked around at our messy, flour-dusted kitchen, at the goat waiting for scraps, at the door to my studio standing slightly ajar. I thought about timelines and deliverables and the quiet satisfaction of a well-organized plan. I thought about clay and glaze and the profound silence of creation. "Yes," I said, and it was the truest thing I'd ever felt. It's exactly what I want. I was building a life, and for the first time, I was the architect of all of it, every single beautiful, chaotic part. The promotion was more than a new title on a business card. It was a key that unlocked a different tier of respect, both from my colleagues and, more importantly, from myself. I navigated the complexities of the Anderson account with a focus that surprised even me, finding a strange, satisfying poetry in managing budgets and timelines that was not so different from planning a firing schedule for a kiln. Both required patience, precision, and a vision for the final product. My life had found a new, exhilarating rhythm, a duet between the structured world of project coordination and the fluid, creative freedom of my studio. I felt, for the first time, like a complete person. This hard-won equilibrium, however, was about to face its most daunting audit, a visit from my father. Where my mother's scrutiny was a laser, pinpoint and direct, my father's was a broad, silent pressure. A retired engineer, he communicated in facts, figures, and tangible results. He loved me, but his love had always felt conditional on me making choices he could logically approve of. My divorce had been, in his eyes, a catastrophic system failure. My subsequent life choices, dating a veterinarian with a goat, pursuing a hobby with fervor, and now, apparently, abandoning a stable secretarial career for a riskier project-based role, were, I was sure, giving him migraines. He arrived on a Saturday morning, his sedan impeccably clean, his handshake firm and brief. His eyes did a quick, analytical sweep of the house, no doubt noting the slight clutter of two merged lives, the dog-eared veterinary journals next to the art books. Tom, to his credit, did not try to oversell himself. He was just Tom. He shook my father's hand, offered him a coffee, and then politely excused himself to check on something in the backyard, giving us space. The interrogation began over the kitchen table. "Project coordinator," my father said, sipping his black coffee. "That's a significant change. What's the salary differential? What are the long-term career projections? Are the benefits comparable?" I answered each question calmly, citing numbers and percentages, outlining the growth potential within the company. I saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. This was a language he understood. I had passed the first test. Then he gestured with his chin toward the studio. "And you're still spending considerable time on the pottery?" "I am," I said, my voice even. "I actually sold a few pieces at a local art walk last month." He blinked, processing this. The concept of art for income was foreign, nebulous territory. "I see. And is that profitable?" Before I could answer, a thunderous crash followed by a high-pitched, startled bleat came from the backyard. We both jumped. My father's eyebrows shot up. "What was that?" "That," I said with a sigh, "is probably Bartholomew." We rose and went to the back door. The scene that greeted us was one of pure, chaotic comedy. Tom was standing by the goat's shed, hands on his hips, trying to look stern but failing miserably. Bartholomew, looking immensely pleased with himself, stood amidst the ruins of a small, rickety side table that had once held his food bowl. He'd apparently decided it was an affront to his dignity and had rammed it until it splintered. Oat pellets were scattered across the grass like confetti. Tom looked up, saw us, and shrugged helplessly. He's protesting the quality of his breakfast service, demanding an upgrade to a stone pedestal, apparently. My father stared, his engineer's mind undoubtedly trying to compute the logic of a goat destroying its own feeder. And then, the most miraculous thing happened. A sound escaped him, a short, sharp exhale that was almost a laugh. He stepped out into the yard, his analytical gaze now fixed on the wreckage. "The structural integrity of that table was always questionable," he announced, kneeling to pick up a piece of the splintered wood. "Pine, too soft, and the joints were weak." He looked at Tom. "You need something solid. Oak, maybe. A thicker gauge for the legs with a proper mortise and tenon joint here," he pointed, "and here. To withstand the impact." Tom looked from the wreckage to my father, a slow grin spreading across his face. "You know, I've been thinking the same thing. I just don't have the right tools for a joint that precise." My father stood up, brushing off his trousers. A gleam I hadn't seen in years was in his eye, the gleam of a problem to be solved. "I have a full workshop in my garage. Dovetail jigs, everything." He looked at the goat, who bleated smugly. "We can't have this kind of shoddy craftsmanship. It's an engineering disgrace." An hour later, I was watching from the porch, a cup of coffee forgotten in my hands. My father and my boyfriend were in the driveway, shoulder to shoulder, rummaging through the trunk of my father's car for a tape measure and a pencil. They were discussing grain direction and load-bearing capacity with the intense focus of two men designing a skyscraper, not a goat feeder. Bartholomew observed them regally from his pen, the victorious monarch surveying his subjects finally attending to his demands. They spent the rest of the day in the garage, the sounds of sawing and sanding filling the air. I brought them sandwiches and iced tea, receiving only absent-minded grunts of thanks. By evening, they emerged, presenting Bartholomew with a magnificent, over-engineered, rock-solid oak feeding stand. It was a masterpiece of joinery. Bartholomew sniffed it, gave it a tentative butt with his head, and, finding it immovable, began to eat, satisfied. My father packed his tools away, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. As he got into his car to leave, he turned to me. "He's a good man," he said, nodding toward Tom, who was waving goodbye. "Practical, knows his way around tools." He paused, and his gaze softened the smallest bit. "And you? You seem like you've got a good handle on things, Amelia." "On all of it." It was the highest praise he could have given. He didn't need to understand my art or my career. He had seen the foundation I had built my life upon, and he had found it, finally, to be structurally sound. The dust from my father's visit settled, leaving behind not tension, but a new, unexpected layer of solidity. The image of him and Tom, two fiercely practical men bonding over the engineering merits of a goat-proof feeder, was something I would cherish forever. It was as if his approval had been the final seal on this new life I'd built, certifying it as structurally sound. With that external validation, however quiet, came a new sense of freedom. The future wasn't just something I was navigating day by day anymore, it was a landscape I could finally start to map with intention. The catalyst for the next step was, like many things in our lives, Bartholomew. His magnificent new feeder, while impervious to his headbutts, did nothing to curb his wanderlust. He discovered that if he timed his charge just right, he could rattle the latch on his gate just enough to jiggle it open. We'd find him on the porch, peering through the screen door, or worse, in my prized petunia bed, looking utterly unrepentant. The backyard, for all its joys, was beginning to feel like a charming but inadequate container for our expanding lives. One evening, after corralling a particularly adventurous Bartholomew from the neighbor's rose bushes, Tom and I collapsed onto the porch steps. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. "We need a bigger fence," I sighed, leaning my head against his shoulder. "Or a moat." Tom was quiet for a moment, his arm around me. "Or," he said, his voice thoughtful, "a different backyard." I lifted my head to look at him. "What do you mean?" He gestured around us. "I love this house, Amelia. It's where I fell in love with you. But it's yours. We've squeezed my life into it and it works, but it's a squeeze. There's no room for a proper garden, or a bigger studio for you, or a real, Bartholomew-proof paddock." He turned to face me, his expression serious but excited. "What if we started looking for a place? A place that's ours. From the ground up." The idea was so big, so monumental, it stole my breath. Selling the house. The last tangible piece of my life with Daniel. The place where I'd cried and burned my memories, and slowly, painstakingly, learned to breathe again. Letting it go felt like closing the final page of a very long, very difficult book. But as I looked at Tom's hopeful face, and then at the determined eyes of a goat who clearly considered any fence a personal challenge, I didn't feel fear. I felt a surge of possibility. This house had been my cocoon. It had protected me while I metamorphosed. But I wasn't that broken creature anymore. I was ready to fly. "Okay," I said, the word feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. "Let's look." The following weekends became consumed by a new shared project, the Great House Hunt. We spent our days driving around the outskirts of town, following real estate listings. Our requirements were unique. We needed space for a veterinary office for Tom to see occasional house call patients, a large, bright room with good ventilation for my studio, and, of course, several fenced acres for a certain Caprine escape artist. We dismissed perfectly nice houses for having bad energy in the kitchen or for having fences. A goat could clearly outsmart. We were about to give up after a particularly disappointing day of viewing homes that were either too modern, too cramped, or too close to neighbors when our agent, a wonderfully patient woman named Brenda, said, "I have one more listing. It's a bit of a wild card. It's not even officially on the market yet. It needs vision." The driveway was long and unpaved, cutting through a grove of old oak trees. And then the house came into view. It wasn't a house, it was a project. A weathered, slightly leaning farmhouse with a wide, wraparound porch. One of the windows was cracked. The paint was peeling. But the land was breathtaking. Rolling hills, a small creek babbling at the bottom of the property, and a massive, solidly built barn that was just begging to be converted into the most incredible studio imaginable. We got out of the car in silence. The air smelled of wild grass and earth. Bartholomew, whom we'd brought along as our official fence tester, let out an approving bleat and immediately began investigating a particularly tasty-looking thistle. Tom turned to me, his eyes wide. "The barn," he whispered. "I know," I breathed. We walked the property for an hour, our excitement growing with every step. We pointed out where a garden could go, where Tom could set up a small outdoor pen for recovering animals, how the sun would hit the barn doors in the afternoon. Perfect light for throwing clay. The house itself was a shell, but a good shell. Strong bones. It wasn't a move-in ready dream home, it was a blank canvas. Our blank canvas. We stood on the porch, looking out at our future. It was wild and overgrown and absolutely perfect. It wasn't about escaping the past anymore. It was about building a future, together, from the ground up. We weren't just buying a house, we were buying a promise. And as Tom took my hand, his grip firm and sure, I knew we had the vision to see it through. The high of finding the property was a potent, dizzying thing. For days, Tom and I moved through our routines in a happy daze, speaking in half sentences and knowing smiles. "The barn," one of us would say, and the other would just sigh contentedly. We'd pull up the listing photos on our phones and trace the lines of the porch, the slope of the land, the sturdy bones of our future. It felt like fate, a reward for all the hard work of healing and rebuilding. We'd found our blank canvas, and we were already painting our future across it in bright, bold strokes. Our offer was prepared with a sense of thrilling inevitability. We met with Brenda, our agent, and signed the papers with a flourish, already discussing paint swatches and where to put the kiln. The waiting period was agony, but it was a sweet agony. We were too excited to be truly anxious. This was meant to be. How could it not be? The call from Brenda came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was elbow deep in clay, experimenting with a new glaze technique for my kintsugi series. My phone buzzed on the workbench, Brenda's name flashing on the screen. I wiped my hands on a towel, a confident smile already on my face. "Hey Brenda, do we have a deal?" There was a pause on the other end, a beat too long. My smile faltered. "Amelia," she said, her voice carefully neutral, the tone she'd used to deliver bad news. "I'm so sorry, there's been another offer. The world didn't stop, but it did tilt on its axis." The lump of clay on my wheel seemed to mock me, a formless mass of potential that suddenly felt foolish. "Another offer?" I repeated, the words feeling thick and foreign. "But it wasn't even on the market. Word gets around," Brenda said gently. "It's a unique property. The other offer came in significantly above asking price. All cash. No contingencies. Each word was a hammer blow. Significantly above. All cash. No contingencies. We were pre-approved, but our offer was contingent on the sale of my house. It was solid, but it wasn't bulletproof. It wasn't a slam dunk. Ours was an offer built on dreams. Theirs was built on financial muscle. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice small. "It means the sellers are leaning toward accepting their offer. They've given us until tomorrow morning to come back with our best and final. But Amelia, to be competitive, we'd have to come up a lot. And we'd likely have to waive the sale contingency." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. The studio, my sanctuary, suddenly felt claustrophobic. The dream that had felt so real, so tangible just hours ago, was evaporating before my eyes, stolen by a faceless, cash-wielding stranger. I found Tom in the backyard, reinforcing a section of the fence Bartholomew had nearly compromised. He took one look at my face and dropped the hammer. "What's wrong?" I told him, the words tumbling out in a shaky rush. "They're going to take the other offer. We can't compete with that. It's over. The despair was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. It felt like losing everything all over again. The future I'd so clearly pictured, the studio in the barn, the garden, the view from that porch dissolved into a bitter fog of what could have been. Tom listened, his face grim. He pulled me into a hug, his grip tight. We stood like that for a long moment, surrounded by the inadequate fence of my old life. Then he held me at arm's length, his expression shifting from defeat to a stubborn, determined light. "No," he said, his voice firm. "It's not over. Not yet. Tom, they have all cash. What can we do?" "We can fight," he said, his jaw set. "We might not have all cash, but we have something they don't. We have us." He took my hand, his eyes burning with intensity. "We need to make them see that. We need to make this personal." An idea, wild and desperate, began to form. "The letter," I whispered. "Brenda said to submit our best and final. That doesn't just have to be money." We spent the rest of the evening at the kitchen table, not with calculators and financial spreadsheets, but with a single sheet of paper and a pen. We wrote a letter, not from buyers to sellers, but from a family to the stewards of a home. We told them about us. About Tom, the veterinarian who dreamed of a place to heal animals under the wide open sky. About me, the artist who saw a cathedral of light and creativity in their old barn. We told them about Bartholomew, the goat who needed roam to roam without terrorizing the petunias. We poured our hearts onto that page, describing not just the house we wanted to buy, but the home we wanted to build, the life we wanted to live within those walls. We offered every dollar we could responsibly afford, but we knew our money wasn't our strongest asset. Our story was. I sealed the envelope with a feeling of terrified hope. It was the most vulnerable I had ever made myself, offering up my deepest hopes and dreams for a stranger's judgment. We were no longer just making a financial bid. We were making an emotional one. We were betting everything on the belief that a home was more than a transaction, that its value couldn't be measured in cash alone. We sent it off and collapsed into bed, exhausted, our future hanging in the balance, suspended by a single heartfelt page. The hours that followed were a special kind of torture. Time didn't just slow down, it congealed, becoming a thick, viscous substance we were forced to wade through. Every minute was an eternity. We tried to distract ourselves. Tom went to the shelter for a few hours. I attempted to throw a new vase, but our efforts were hollow, ghostly imitations of normal life. My hands on the clay felt numb, disconnected from my brain, which was screaming on a constant, silent loop. What if? What if? What if? The letter had been an act of pure, desperate vulnerability. We had ripped open our chests and shown our beating hearts to complete strangers. Now, we were just waiting to see if they would hand them back gently or drop them on the floor. The silence from Brenda was deafening. Every buzz of my phone sent a jolt of adrenaline so sharp through my system I thought I might vomit. It was always a text from Tom, anything.e, or my mother, any news on the house, sweetie? Each notification was a tiny, cruel heart attack. By late afternoon, I was a raw nerve. I paced the length of the house, from the kitchen to the studio and back again, a caged animal. The walls I had once found comforting now felt like they were closing in, a constant reminder of the life we were so desperate to upgrade from. Tom came home, his own anxiety written in the tight line of his shoulders. He didn't ask if I'd heard anything. He could see the answer on my face. We made dinner together in a strained silence, the clatter of pots and pans the only sound. We were both braced for impact, shoulders hunched against the blow we were certain was coming. We had dared to hope too loudly, too specifically. We had painted a picture of our future so vivid we could almost smell the wild grass on that land, and now the universe was preparing to tear that canvas to shreds. The fear wasn't just about losing the house, it was about the shattering of the dream itself. It felt like a test we were about to fail. We were mechanically washing the dishes, not speaking, lost in our own grim thoughts, when my phone buzzed on the counter. We both froze. It was Brenda. I looked at Tom, my eyes wide with panic. He nodded, his face pale, and gave my hand a quick, damp squeeze. "Answer it." My hand shook as I picked up the phone. I swiped to answer and put it on speaker, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently I was sure Brenda could hear it over the line. "Brenda?" My voice was a thin, reedy thread. Amelia, her voice came through, and I couldn't read it. It was professional. Calm. Are you with Tom? Yes, you're on speaker, I said, my grip on the counter turning my knuckles white. This was it. The polite, apologetic letdown. I'm so sorry, they were very moved by your letter. But the other offer was just too strong. There was a pause, and then Brenda's tone shifted, warming by 10 degrees. Well, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I just got off the phone with the sellers. They read your letter. In fact, they read it 3 times. Tom's hand found mine again, his grip tight. And, I breathed, barely able to form the word, and they've accepted your offer. The words didn't compute at first. They hung in the air between us, meaningless sounds. I stared at Tom, and he stared back, our faces identical masks of stunned disbelief. What? Tom finally managed, his voice cracking. They accepted, Brenda said, her professionalism finally breaking into genuine excitement. They said the letter did it. They're an older couple, raised their kids in that house. They said they've been worried about who would buy it, some developer who might tear it down or let it go to ruin. They said they wanted it to go to someone who would love it like they did. They said your story, well, it reminded them of their own when they were starting out. The news hit me then, not in a wave, but in a series of tremors. First, a violent, full-body shiver. Then, my knees went weak. I slid down the kitchen cabinet to the floor, the phone clutched in my hand. A sound escaped me, half sob, half laugh, and then the tears came. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming seismic relief. The tension of the last 24 hours, the last months, the last years, broke all at once. Tom was on the floor beside me in an instant, pulling me into a crushing hug, his own laughter mingling with my tears. We got it, he kept saying into my hair, his voice thick with emotion. We got it, Amelia. It's ours. We sat there on the cool kitchen tiles, 2 grown adults laughing and crying, holding on to each other like we were the only solid thing in a spinning world. The fear, the doubt, the agonizing weight, it all melted away, replaced by a joy so profound it was dizzying. We had fought for our future not with money, but with honesty. We had shown our hearts, and someone had chosen to handle them with care. The house wasn't just a property, it was a validation. Our weird, wonderful, goat-filled dream was real, and it was waiting for us. The weeks between the accepted offer and closing were a surreal limbo, a breath held for an impossibly long time. We existed in a state of heightened reality, where every conversation circled back to paint samples, barn dimensions, and the best way to design a goat-proof pasture. My current house, once a sanctuary, had now fully transformed into a waiting room. Boxes began to accumulate in corners like growing stalagmites, filled with things we wouldn't need in the immediate future. Each packed box was a tiny act of faith, a declaration that we believed the dream was actually, finally, going to come true. The day of the closing arrived with the stark, bright clarity of a spring morning. Sitting across the massive oak table from the sellers, an elderly couple with kind eyes and weathered hands made the entire experience feel less like a transaction and more like a passing of the torch. They spoke about the apple tree in the backyard that their children had climbed, about the way the light hit the porch in the evening, about the family of foxes that lived in the woods at the edge of the property. They weren't just selling us a house, they were entrusting us with a legacy. When I signed the final paper, my hand was steady. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the most important beginning of my life. The first thing we did when we got the keys was drive straight there. We didn't bring a single box. We just stood in the empty living room, the silence of the house, a vast, expectant thing. The air smelled of old wood and dust and possibility. We didn't speak. We just walked from room to room, our footsteps echoing on the bare floors, touching the walls, claiming the space not with furniture, but with our presence. Tom stopped in the center of the living room, a huge, goofy grin spreading across his face. "We should christen it," he announced. "With what? We don't even have a bottle of water," I laughed. "Not that," he said, and before I knew what was happening, he had swept me up into his arms and was waltzing me around the empty room, humming a terribly off-key rendition of a classical waltz. Our laughter bounced off the walls, the first new sound in the house that was truly, wholly ours. We danced through the kitchen, the dining room, down the hallway, our joy too big to be contained. It was ridiculous and perfect. Our first memory in our new home wasn't of moving boxes or arranging furniture. It was of a spontaneous, joyful dance in an empty room. The real work began the next day. Moving was a chaotic, exhausting ballet of cardboard, sweat, and disassembled furniture. Friends came to help, and the house slowly filled with the chaotic energy of a new life being assembled. But amidst the chaos, I stole moments. I would slip away from the fray and just stand in the center of the barn. I'd close my eyes and listen to the wind outside and imagine the whir of the wheels, the smell of wet clay, the shelves slowly filling with new creations born in this light-filled space. On our first official night, we were surrounded by a maze of boxes. We were too tired to unpack anymore, too tired to cook. We ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor of the living room, leaning against a stack of boxes labeled kitchen. We had no TV, no internet, no curtains on the windows. The setting sun streamed into the room, painting everything in gold. Bartholomew, utterly confused but delighted by the vast, empty spaces to explore, trotted through the room, bleating his approval. Tom reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His face was smudged with dust, his hair a mess, but his eyes were shining with a happiness so pure it made my heart ache. "We're really here," he said, his voice full of quiet wonder. I looked around at the cardboard chaos, at the dust motes dancing in the golden light, at the man I loved, at the goat investigating an empty cardboard tube. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and unfinished, and there was a mountain of work ahead of us. But it was ours. Every splinter in the floorboard, every crack in the plaster, every inch of land outside. It was all ours to build on, to love, to fill with a lifetime of new memories. "I know," I whispered, squeezing his hand. I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching the sun dip below the tree line, painting the sky in fiery hues. The past was a closed door. The future was this empty, beautiful room. And for the first time, I wasn't just ready for it. I was exhilarated. The first true morning in the new house dawned not with an alarm, but with a loud, inquisitive bleat directly outside our bedroom window. I opened my eyes. The light filtering through the bare window was different here, softer, filtered through the leaves of the old oaks, and it carried the scent of damp earth and wild grass. For a single, disorienting second, I didn't know where I was. The room was unfamiliar, the shadows falling in strange places across boxes we hadn't unpacked. Then I felt Tom's steady breathing beside me, and it all came flooding back. The house, the land, the dance in the empty living room, the pizza on the floor. Our life. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded across the cool wood floor to the window. Bartholomew was in his new paddock, already hard at work inspecting the integrity of the fence posts with his forehead. Beyond him, the property stretched out, mist rising from the creek in gentle tendrils, the world painted in the muted golden green of very early morning. It was so quiet. Not the silence of my old neighborhood, which was always punctuated by the distant hum of traffic or a neighbor's car starting. This was a profound, deep country quiet, broken only by the chirping of birds and, of course, the goat. My heart swelled with a feeling so immense it had no name. It was peace, it was pride, it was the dizzying thrill of ownership, all rolled into one. I heard the bed creak behind me. Tom came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood there for a long time, just watching the day begin. "It's really ours," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "It's really ours," I echoed, leaning back into his warmth. The day was spent in a frenzy of unpacking. We started with the kitchen because coffee was a non-negotiable priority. Finding the coffee maker felt like an archaeological dig, buried deep in a box marked Kitchen Essentials. But once we had mugs in hand, everything felt more manageable. We worked in comfortable tandem, falling into an easy rhythm. He'd break down boxes, I'd find homes for things. We argued playfully over where the plates should go and made unanimous decisions to leave entire boxes of miscellaneous for another day. In the afternoon, we took a break. We carried our fresh cups of coffee out onto the wide, wraparound porch. We still didn't have any furniture, so we just sat on the top step, our shoulders touching. Bartholomew trotted over and laid his head in my lap with a contented sigh, as if he'd been doing it his whole life. "I was thinking," Tom said, sipping his coffee, "for the barn, for your studio. We should run a proper electrical line out there first thing. For the kiln and the wheels. Can't have you blowing a fuse every time you fire a piece. I looked at him, this man who was already thinking about the practicalities of my dreams. He wasn't just building a life with me, he was building a foundation for my art. That sounds perfect, I said. And after that, he continued, a playful glint in his eye, we build the goat his own obstacle course. I think he's bored. I laughed, the sound echoing out into the quiet land. Of course, a priority. We lapsed back into silence, but it was the best kind of silence, the kind filled with shared plans and unspoken understanding. I looked out at our land, at the creek, the trees, the old barn waiting for its transformation. This was the upgrade. Not just a bigger house or more acreage. It was the space physical and emotional to become exactly who we were meant to be. It was the freedom to be messy, to build, to create, to fail, and to try again. It was the knowledge that the past was truly behind us, not because we'd run from it, but because we'd walked through it hand in hand and built something new from its ashes. The sun was warm on my face. Tom's hand found mine. Bartholomew snored softly in my lap. This was it. This was the happy, traditional build, but it was built on a uniquely us foundation. Our perfect life wasn't going to be found in a magazine. It was going to be built right here, with our own two hands, one imperfect, beautiful day at a time. And as I sat on the steps of my new home, surrounded by the two beings I loved most in the world, I knew that every broken heartache, every moment of doubt, every tear shed had been worth it. They had all led me here. To this porch, to this peace, to this wildly, wonderfully upgraded life.